What is the difference between intuition and your thinking mind?
Yeah. So especially when you have more distortion patterns, it can be harder to tell, to be perfectly honest, because what you're perceiving often will be distortion, right? So you can't tell the difference between the two. And as you rise in frequency resonance and you release more distortion patterns, it becomes clearer. But to answer your question, one is that it comes with like a strong knowingness. And the second is more like chattery, and then it will like spin, it will devolve into a lot of what ifs. So the problem with having a lot of distortion patterns is the mind can kick in really quick and you can start to doubt. But I'll just give you a little story just to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is actually a story of Chris, because he often will tell the story because he's like, I don't feel anything, I don't know anything. So he's like, but if this happened for me, it can happen for you. Okay, this is like his usual framework around this particular story. But what happened was my mom had fallen. Okay, so this is a number of years ago. She'd fallen and she had actually torn her meniscus and it had flipped like up, like your meniscus is like this over your knee. And so she tore it and it flipped like this. So it was upside down. And so she was in a lot of pain.
That's painful.
Yeah. So she couldn't stand up. She couldn't weight bear. It was like terrible. So of course, my father was alive at that time. They called us. They're like, what do we do? Right? Like mom, like obviously is in a lot of pain and can't move. Okay. So Chris starts driving, because they lived in Oakland at the time and we lived in San Francisco. So he's got to cross the Bay Bridge in order to get to them, to pick them up, because they don't have a car and they would be relying on public transit, and my mom can't walk. So obviously someone has to go drive them. Okay. So Chris is on his way to go pick her up. And I'm like, where are you going to take her? And he's like, he paused for a second. I was talking to him on the phone, right? So I called him on the cell phone. I'm like, where are you taking her? And he's like, we're going to take her to, he's like, what you're going to do is read to me all the clinic locations of CPMC, okay, which is like a larger hospital network in San Francisco. I'm like, okay. So I Google it, and I don't know where they are, because we don't typically go to the hospital. We don't have to, which is great, right? So I don't know where they all are. So I start reading him the locations, okay? And I'm like, what's odd about what he's asking me is that CPMC is a hospital network in San Francisco. My parents live in Oakland, right? So it's kind of like a little bit weird. So I'm like, all right. So I start reading him all the locations. And one of the locations, and the biggest one, is in a neighborhood called Pacific Heights. And then I'm reading the location, and he says that one. But the one that I'd read was in a neighborhood called the Castro, and it was a much smaller location. And he's like, that one, we have to bring her there. And I'm thinking to myself, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, he's crossing the bridge, like, to go to Oakland. There are lots of other Oakland hospitals and whatever. But he's like, no, that's the one. I'm positive. I'm like, okay.
And you trust him?
Yeah, I trust him.
Yeah.
He was so strong in his knowingness, right? And he's like, I know it doesn't make sense. It makes no logical sense, but I know that's where we have to take her. I'm like, okay. So he picks up my parents, right? He brings them all away. It's like an hour, okay? An hour and some to get there. And then he has to like fight traffic to come back. And my mom's in pain, right? So he's like, but he's following his intuition, right? Like I said, there are a lot of options in Oakland, but he's like, no, it's the one in the Castro. So he manages to get them to the Castro location. And they get a wheelchair, and they get my mom into the wheelchair. And as he's wheeling my mother into this emergency room, which is small, literally at the same time, a man walks in. And he's a young man who's a doctor who's starting his shift, who happens to be the partner of one of our friends who's a real estate agent. And this guy looks at Chris, and Chris looks at the guy, and Chris is like, Alex? And Alex looks at Chris and goes, Chris? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, yeah. And so Alex says, I'm just about to start my shift. Like, literally, they're crossing paths as they enter the emergency room.
Yeah.
So what happens? He knows us. So there's like this fast track of like, I don't know, magic that happens, including, by the way, he gets on the phone with the Stanford sports medicine people. And my mother ends up, I don't even know how this happens. She ends up having surgery like within 48 hours. Really fast, with the guy who does all the knee surgeries for the San Francisco 49ers. Like, that's the guy who does her knee. Okay? I'm like, how did that happen? Wow. But if Chris hadn't listened, that wouldn't have happened.
No.
You know, it was like perfect. Like literally, they were walking in at the same time.
They would have been waiting and waiting.
They would have been waiting and waiting, and who knows when she would have had the surgery, and who knows who would have done the surgery, and all this sort of stuff. And he's like, "Oh, I do knees all the time.
That's my thing.
It's my thing." Right? Like that's what he does.
Wow.
And I was like, "Wow." So that's what happens when you follow your intuition. So for him, like again, that made no sense, right? Like logically, if you'd done the pros and cons, you would have been like crackpot, right? Like there's no way that makes sense to bring her all the way over here. You know what I mean?
Right.
In traffic, she's in pain, all this stuff. But when you fall, it was like such a strong knowingness for him.